This is the Brooks Range in Alaska. It's not only one of the most remote places in North America, but anywhere on the planet. In some areas, you could quite literally be the only person for hundreds of miles in every direction. And so it's maybe the last place you'd ever want to become stranded. In 1981, that is exactly what happened to a wildlife photographer. He had brought enough supplies to survive for months, but when summer came to an end, he made a horrifying realization. Something had gone wrong and he had no way to leave. This is his horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In August of 1981, Carl McCunn sat completely still in silence as his eyes scanned his surroundings. The warmth of the morning sun felt good in his face, and it was shaping up to be a beautiful day, at least as far as the weather was concerned. Holding a rifle in his hands while waiting for the next unlucky duck to fly by, he couldn't help but think about how desperate his situation was getting. By then, he'd been alone for months at a remote lake in the Alaskan wilderness, and things were great for a while, but recently, fear and doubt had started to replace the enjoyment he once felt toward his situation. He was supposed to be back home by then, but for reasons he couldn't quite figure out in the isolation of the wilderness, his ride had never showed up. Or at least it hadn't yet anyway, and he was beginning to wonder if his instructions had somehow gotten confused or misinterpreted. At the moment, the reason didn't really matter. Knowing what happened wouldn't change anything. By then, his once plentiful supplies were starting to run low, and the long stretch of summer he expected to spend photographing wildlife was starting to turn into something else entirely. He made up his mind at that moment. His months-long expedition had crossed into something terrible. As his mind crept deeper and deeper into this line of thought, a distant sound snapped Carl back to the present. The realization of what it was hit him, and he rushed to his feet so he could see if his ears were just playing tricks on him. The plane appeared like a speck on the horizon and it was headed right for him. This was the moment he'd been waiting weeks for, and he wasn't about to let it pass without making himself as visible as possible. Carl then dropped his rifle and ran to his campsite to grab the bright orange cover for his sleeping bag. As the plane approached, he started waving it in all directions, just trying to catch the pilot's eye. Above him, the plane circled over the lake and passed right above his camp, and as it did, Carl kept waving. From the ground, he had no way of knowing what the pilot could see or what the scene below him looked like from the air. All he knew was that after waiting so long and wondering so often whether anyone was looking for him, there was finally a sign of life beyond the animals and dense forest he was surrounded by. The plane came around for a second pass, and Carl continued to flap the cover over his head. For a brief moment, he just knew he had been saved, but it was a feeling that wouldn't last. He noticed something off about the plane. The aircraft above him had wheels, not floats. That meant it couldn't land there and pick him up. So dejected, Carl lowered the sleeping bag cover and started walking back to his campsite. Unfortunately, it might not have occurred to him that at least he was spotted and that his exact location was known by someone in the outside world. All that seemed to matter right then was that his ordeal wasn't coming to an immediate close. The plane then continued its second circle around Carl's head as he suddenly stopped and looked back up at the aircraft. While standing still, he raised his right hand to about shoulder height and shook his fist toward the plane. He didn't know it at the time, but this was a horrifying mistake. Long before Carl found himself alone at the lake, watching the plane circle above him, Alaska had already become central to his life. He wasn't born there, but he seemed to have been the kind of person who was always going to end up in a place like it. Carl was born in Munich, Germany, while his father was stationed there with the US Army. He was later raised in San Antonio, Texas, where he finished high school in 1964. For a brief time, he attended community college before dropping out and joining the US Navy instead, serving 4 years before being discharged in 1969. After leaving the Navy, Carl went north. He worked on a ferry that ran between Seattle and Alaska, and somewhere along the way, the state seems to have gotten its hooks into him. He spent a short time living in Seattle, but by around 1970, he had settled in Anchorage. From that point on, Alaska was no longer a place he just passed through or visited, it became home. And his comfort level with the Alaskan wilderness is vital to understand, because it's easy to look at the situation Carl had gotten himself into and assume he was hopelessly unprepared. By 1981, he had already spent years in the state and he was familiar with life in remote country. As a budding wildlife photographer, he was drawn to the harder, lonelier parts of the state, where getting the photograph meant committing yourself fully to the landscape around you. He had even done something very similar before. In 1976, Carl had spent 5 months living in the Brooks Range, which is a huge and isolated area of northern Alaska's mountains that can feel almost otherworldly in its size and emptiness. That earlier experience probably did a lot to influence the way he saw his 1981 trip. He had already proven to himself that he could stay out in the wild for months at a time and live the kind of life most people would only ever read about. By all accounts as well, Carl was not a man who simply blended into the background. He was 34 years old in 1981, stood 6'2", weighed around 240 pounds, and had curly reddish blonde hair. He also had the type of outgoing personality most people remembered. Everything about him suggested someone who believed he could handle a challenge and even took pride in being able to live a little farther out on the edge than most people ever would. In short, by the time Carl began preparing for his 1981 trip, he saw it simply as an extended photography stay, not a life-or-death gamble. In March of that year, he arranged to be flown into a remote, unnamed lake area roughly 225 miles north of Fairbanks along the southern edge of the Brooks Range. He intended to remain there for about 5 months, staying into mid-August while photographing wildlife as the animals returned to their summer grounds. Crucially, Carl didn't head out there light. He brought around 500 rolls of film, 1,400 pounds of provisions, 2 rifles, and a shotgun. He had more than enough to support himself with plenty of food, weapons, camera supplies, and time. And at first, the trip appears to have unfolded more or less the way he would have hoped it would. The wildlife in the area was active and photogenic, which was exactly why he had gone there in the first place. He had the supplies he needed, the solitude he wanted, the scenery to complement his art, and complete isolation. It was in these early days, though, that he made the first small decision that would come back to haunt him. Convinced that he wouldn't need them, Carl threw away 5 boxes of shotgun shells into the river near his camp. It probably seemed harmless at the time since he already had so much with him, and in that moment the extra ammunition must have felt unnecessary. Later though, when food became scarce, Carl would think about the shells again and again. There was another issue that would dwarf the decision to dump the shells though. What Carl didn't fully appreciate, or at least didn't plan the way he should have, was that no amount of food or field experience could protect him from a bad exit plan. He had worked hard to prepare for living out there. The real trouble though was that getting in was only half the problem. Eventually, somebody had to come back and get him, and that part of the trip was resting on shaky understanding. At some point before heading out, Carl came to believe that a pilot friend of his, Rory Cruikshank, would pick him back up in August. Carl had enough money to hire an air taxi to fly him into the wilderness, but not enough to pay for a flight back out. So the return leg, which was the part of the trip that mattered every bit as much as the flight in, appears to have rested on the idea that Rory would come for him later. The problem was that this arrangement was never clearly nailed down. He had apparently never made absolutely certain that Rory had agreed to retrieve him at the end of the summer. But worse than that, he also seemed to have failed to clearly communicate some of the most basic details of the plan. He never told Rory that he had hired an air taxi to take him to the lake area. In other words, the man Carl was counting on to fly him back out may not have fully understood how Carl had gotten there in the first place, let alone that he expected to pick him up months later. And Rory's version of things only made the situation look muddier. According to him, Carl had given him money to help repair his plane and fly him in, but not necessarily to bring him back out. Rory also said that he told Carl there was a chance he would be working in Anchorage at the end of the summer and that Carl should not depend on him. If that was true, then Carl either misunderstood what he'd been told or chose to hear what he wanted to hear. Neither possibility was good though. To make matters worse, Carl's campsite was off the regular flight routes. It wasn't the kind of place where a passing pilot was likely to stumble across him by chance. If his pickup didn't come, there was no reason to think somebody else would just happen to appear overhead. And this hung over the trip from the beginning, even if Carl did not fully feel it at first. As long as the summer held and his supplies remained in decent shape, it was easy to assume that the loose ends would somehow work themselves out. By early August, however, the time when he expected the plane home to appear, no one had come and no one was on the way. It was around this time when Carl was just starting to figure out that something had gone wrong. At the same time, though, there was still reason for a bit of optimism. The pickup might have been delayed if the weather had gotten in the way. Maybe the plane would appear tomorrow or the day after that. As the days kept passing with no aircraft showing up for him, the situation became harder to explain away, though. In a diary Carl kept, he admitted that he should have shown more foresight when arranging his departure, and once that realization set in, his priorities changed fast. Carl began to stretch what remained of his provisions and turned more seriously toward the land around him for food. He set up a net weighted with chain links and tried to fish the nearby creek that fed into the lake. One day, Carl spotted a caribou that was dying in the lake, and the next day he waded chest deep into the cold water to retrieve it. His diary entry that day was one of excitement and celebration, and he focused heavily on the animal once he had it. He ate part of the liver first and then cut steaks from the hindquarters. He also tried drying the meat to make it last, and it was a big boost in his confidence that he could survive off the land long enough to be picked up. While all of this was happening though, the area around him was growing steadily more miserable. The weather stayed relatively warm for a while, but that didn't mean it was a pleasant experience. Temperatures could remain above 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 Celsius, yet the rain kept coming, the winds pushed in from the south, and the tundra was filled with stinging insects. Carl was constantly tired, soaked, and under constant pressure to provide calories for himself as the situation got worse day by day. As this was going on, he seems to have clung to the hope that somebody in the outside world would eventually realize he was missing and come looking for him. He had sent maps to his friends and to his father with his campsite marked, but the information wasn't terribly precise. His father knew generally where Carl would be, but not exactly when he planned to return. But worse still, Carl had previously told his father not to worry if he stayed out longer than expected. After a previous trip had caused enough concern for his father to call the police, Carl had asked him not to do that ever again. Carl's friends weren't terribly alarmed by his absence either. Some later said they assumed he had already come out of the wild and was working in Paxson. So essentially, the people who might have been the first to get help had no reason to believe help was needed yet, or were even explicitly told not to worry like his father. This meant Carl was running low, improvising meals, and watching the pickup date slide farther into the past while the people back home hadn't even begun to panic. And that brings us back to late August. Just when his situation had begun to feel frighteningly hopeless, Carl heard the sound he had been waiting for. It was the noise from that approaching plane. That's when he grabbed the bright orange cover from his sleeping bag. As he frantically waved it over his head, Carl watched the plane begin to circle directly above him. At that point, he was sure the pilot had seen him, but when he noticed the plane wasn't equipped to land on or near the lake, he stopped waving the sleeping bag cover. A few moments later, Carl raised his fist in the air and shook it before the aircraft completed a third circle and flew off. His disappointment came from the fact that the plane couldn't land right away and pick him up immediately, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he was likely as good as saved anyway. Someone had seen him and knew exactly where he was, so maybe the pilot was returning to retrieve a better suited plane. Or maybe the rescue would come on foot and it might take a few more days. Either way, his optimism began to grow to a point where he started preparing his belongings to break camp. While doing this though, something in him told him to check a survival resource he had with him. It was a card showing what certain hand signals meant to pilots, and when he recognized the meaning of the shaken fist in air, his heart sank. Without realizing it, Carl had shown the pilot the signal for all okay. What he had intended as a simple gesture of frustration might have ruined his only chance of being rescued before winter really set in. In his journal, Carl really beat himself up over this. His situation was already becoming critical, and with one accidental, unwise gesture, he had made it hopeless. Without any other choice, he kept putting his efforts into survival. At some point after the flyover, Carl found a small cache of supplies while digging a shallow trench in preparation for winter. It wasn't some miracle stash that solved his problems, but in his condition, even a few useful items made a difference. The cache contained some rabbit snares and pieces of candle. It might have seemed insignificant in any other scenario, but for Carl, it meant he could expand his hunting efforts and have a bit of light as the night stretched longer. He also continued hunting when he got the chance, and on one occasion he spotted his first wolf. In a rush, he fired at it and heard it yelp before it vanished into the brush and got away. Afterward, he was frustrated with himself for taking the shot too soon. In hindsight, he thought he should have waited and let the animal come a little closer. This was yet another mistake that said a lot about where his mind was by then. He was replaying mistakes and missed opportunities, understanding all too well that one bad decision could be the difference between eating and going hungry. As food grew scarcer, Carl became less selective. He salvaged what he could from carcasses partially eaten by hawks and other predators. He put rabbit heads on fish hooks in an attempt to catch a fox or wolf, but what he was really hoping for was a moose to cross his path. That would keep him well fed for months, but it just never happened. More than anything though, he prayed for another plane to come flying overhead, but that never happened either. Eventually, his camp supplies dwindled to just a few spoonfuls of beans after he had consumed all of his rice. Then, with his beans down to only just about a meal's worth, he was reduced to swallowing handfuls of spices that he had in his camp. Every so often, he'd pour crushed red pepper, thyme, or salt into his palm and choke them down just to put something into his stomach. As time went on, he even ate the rabbit heads he had originally used as bait, and eventually he turned to tree bark. September soon turned to October, and all the while, the season was turning. He also had to travel for firewood, partly because he didn't want to strip the land immediately around his camp. Even while starving and growing increasingly desperate for food, part of him still cared about leaving the place as he had found it, but that came at a cost. Every trip away from the camp took energy he could not easily replace. For a short time, Carl thought about going on the move permanently. A state trooper who had spoken with Carl before the trip told him about a hunting cabin about 5 miles away from his campsite. The trooper even marked it on a map for him, but why Carl never made use of that cabin remains unclear. He might have thought that he couldn't reach it safely once conditions began to worsen, or he could have believed that staying put gave him a better chance of being found. Whatever the reason though, he remained where he was. By October, survival was no longer just a matter of finding enough to eat. Carl's body was beginning to fail him. The food problem had already become severe, but now cold was competing with hunger as the worst of Carl's problems. Snow had settled in and the lake had frozen over, and each passing day seemed to strip away a little more of his strength. The day isn't known because Carl never dated his diary entries, but at some point in October he wrote to complain that his hands were growing more frostbitten by the day, and their worsening condition was crushing. His hands were how he worked, how he loaded his weapons, and how he set his snares. As the frostbite advanced, even basic survival tasks became harder to carry out. By this point, his food stores were long gone. Once he finished the last of his beans, there was nothing between him and starvation except whatever he could trap or scavenge, and there weren't many options. The snares he set for rabbits were too often raided before he got to them. Over and over again, wolves and foxes beat him to his own trapped animals. When Carl checked the lines, what he sometimes found was not meat but mere scraps. Things like hair, guts, and 4 feet. As desperate as he was though, Carl would eat whatever was left anyway. At some point, while weighing his dwindling options, Carl considered trying to walk to Fort Yukon, which is about 75 miles or 121 kilometers away. Under better conditions, that would have been daunting enough. With the shape Carl was in, it was almost impossible. He was already weakened by starvation, and the snow made any long trek even more punishing. Whatever thoughts he had of walking were at odds with what his body could still do. He was simply too far gone, and the land between him and help was too unforgiving. The cold sapped what little energy and motivation he still had, and his appendages were only getting worse from frostbite. The less food he got, the weaker he became, and the weaker he became, the harder it was to get food. As a result of all of this, by Thanksgiving, his diary entries began to take on a dark tone. Carl wrote about dizzy spells and almost constant chills. He said he felt miserable and admitted that he did not think he could take much more. He also wrote that he could not stop thinking about the one bullet he was saving, just in case. His thoughts also kept circling back to food, which was torturous on its own considering the severity of his hunger. He dreamed of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, banana pudding and cheesecake. He even wrote a plea in his diary asking God to send him a moose or plane overhead, one ideally carrying some peanut butter. Eventually he wrote that he would still dream about eating, but he wouldn't really feel hungry anymore. Mostly he just felt tired and worn down. And this may have been one of the clear signs that starvation had entered its final stage. The body, after enough deprivation, stops protesting with the same intensity, and hunger pangs give way to weakness and pain. Carl wrote that his nose stung and that his fingers and toes hurt from the freezing temperatures. Even when there was nothing to do but endure, his body would not let him forget where he was. Maybe more than anything, Carl was growing tired of remembering. Sometime after he ran out of food, in the midst of all this thinking, Carl finally landed on a decision. One day in December, Carl used what remained of his fuel to make himself a big warm fire, and then he sat down to write again. In his diary, he asked God to forgive his weaknesses and sins, and he asked that his family be watched over. He also left behind a letter to his father. In it, he explained how his film should be developed. He asked that his belongings be given to his father by whoever found him, and he even suggested that the person who discovered him could keep the rifle and the shotgun for their troubles. Carl, in his own way, was getting his affairs in order. At some point, after writing those notes, he pinned his Alaska's driver's license to them. Then he grabbed his rifle and the final bullet. He penned one final line in his diary, writing, quote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Carl's body was not found right away. It would be weeks before the people in his life became alarmed enough to ask authorities to go looking for him. By January 19th, 1982, friends finally grew concerned and requested that a search begin. It wasn't until January 26th that a state trooper was finally able to fly over the site, and when he did, he saw no signs of life. The temperature at the time was around a dangerous minus 46 degrees. A few days later, on February 2nd, a ski-equipped plane carrying several state troopers finally landed at the lake to check the camp directly. What they found confirmed the end Carl had already recorded in his diary. His tent was zipped shut, and when troopers cut it open, they found Carl inside, frozen and badly emaciated. Along with his body was the diary he kept throughout the ordeal, roughly 100 pages of notes that preserved the long unraveling of his final months. When a coroner's inquest was finally held in July of 1982, it helped reveal just how much Carl's ordeal had been the product of not a single disaster, but a handful of assumptions, misread signals, and incomplete information. The testimony painted a picture of a man who had gone into the wilderness, believing the loose ends of his trip were tied down well enough, when in reality they were anything but. One of the most important points to come out of the inquest was that of the pilot who flew over Carl and witnessed his hand gesture and behavior. He testified that he saw no reason to believe Carl needed help. From the air, his actions and demeanor did not register as distress. He was seen waving his orange sleeping bag cover casually, then walking back toward his tent. Once Carl mistakenly gave the all okay signal, he didn't think any further into it. The trooper just circled and moved on, believing there was no emergency unfolding below him. Tragically, it proved to be Carl's best chance of rescue, and it was all wiped away by a fist shaken toward the sky. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.